Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the stage Greg Lindsay from the New Cities Foundation.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to go to our second sort of plenary discussion of the morning, and after this, we'll adjourn for lunch. This is the part of the day where we're going to get really, I think, neck deep into discussions of the state of the art of autonomy, really where autonomous vehicles, how far behind, objects in your rearview mirror may be closer than they appear. So we'll see how close they really are. We're also getting into some discussions, I think, of autonomous logistics and really sort of the revolutions in urban logistics that are beginning to happen. And yeah, for the structure of this session, we're going to have 5 brief presentations by our panelists who will present one by one. We'll all take a seat, we'll have a conversation with them for a while, and I promise to leave more time for questions from you, the audience, and your collective intelligence. So with that, I'd like to bring up our first speaker, which is Guy Fraker of AutonomousStuff. Thank you, Guy.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Ryan, for a great opening today. What I want to do is leave you today, I want to, in 5 minutes, leave you with 3 questions. And I think they're fundamentally the most important questions that we hold off from answering. I also want to bring forward a concept that with all of the great things that we've talked about, let me make sure this is working. With all of the wonderful things that we've talked about so far, I want to give you a basis that what we've achieved is largely incremental. The disruption that we talk about in these technologies is in their potential. We haven't achieved it yet. Why haven't we? A lot of reasons. But in a lot of cases, what we find is that we're focusing on the wrong questions that get in the way of the right questions. So what are the right questions? Let me give you one quick bit of context. So AutonomousStuff is a company that distributes the technologies needed for autonomy and test platforms. So we're the leading provider of autonomous control systems and perception systems for test vehicles in North America, South America, India, and Australia. My role in a masochistic kind of existence as a consultant is to help the industries that are going to be impacted by these technologies embrace them. And when you are in the insurance industry, which I was for 20 years, or you work in big oil, something like what we're talking about here, where the convergence of shared mobility and autonomous mobility come together, it is a huge disruptor. Now, as we're meeting on the day after Veterans Day here in the United States, let me put this other tidbit in context. We have repeated the fatality count of World War II twice since the end of World War II in our cars. If that isn't enough of a compelling reason to change, so I don't know what is. But then there's all these other societal benefits. So what are the 3 questions that we should focus on in order to embrace an exponential technology? Question number 1, how good is good enough? We're going to hold the machines to a much higher standard than we hold ourselves. If it's 100% reliability in all conditions, then we can all go home. Not even our plumbing works that well, right? So how good is good enough? Is a 90% reduction in fatalities? Is a 40% reduction in ownership? We have to decide a very fundamental question. How good is good enough? Question number 2, what do we want from mobility that we don't have today? Because unless we're talking about a conference on teleportation, it can be built. Do you want your car to notify you when something goes wrong at home? We can do that. Do you want to broadcast to your friends where you are? We can do that. Literally, whatever the answer to that question is that you come up with, it can be built. Third question is the scariest question for organizations trying to figure out how to enter the world of embracing a disruptive technology. And that is the most powerful question I've found in innovation. What if? Now, it's a terrifying question for large organizations to ask, and regulatory entities, public and private sector both, because once you know, you can't unknow. how I made the transition from the insurance industry into autonomous vehicles came with a what-if question. It was 2008, and it was my son. He was 24. Some of you have heard this before, but he came to me and he said, check out this video of Google's car. This is great. And I said, what do you think? And he said, he looked at me and he said, Dad, it means I get to own a car someday. He's autistic. He got it in 30 seconds. It took me a week to get my head wrapped around what my son had just told me. How good is good enough? What do we want from our mobility systems that we don't have today? And what if? Those are the questions that can get ahead of the technology, because I'll tell you one thing, I'll leave you with this. This technology is moving so fast, and the cost of doing it is collapsing so fast, that if we don't decide as large industries and private and public partnerships how to answer those three questions, we'll be delaying the societal benefits that are an inevitability of these coming together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guy. Our second speaker is Donald High from Walmart. Please come on up, Don.
My daughter Nicole is very pregnant. Now you may be wondering what that has to do with mobility, disrupting mobility, but if you've ever been pregnant, you know that that is a major problem, is mobility. But she recently decided to have a baby gender revealing party, and the whole family got together, and I have 6 kids, so that's a big mass, except for one, my son, who lives too far away and wasn't able to make it. And what they did was, in order for him to be there at the moment they cut the cake to see if it was blue or pink, they had him on a tablet, and my granddaughters were walking around with a tablet all over the room, and we were interacting back and forth with Jeremy because Jeremy couldn't make it. Jeremy and his wife, they were both sitting on the couch. And it was really weird to me. This is a new thing. I've never done that before, where I had somebody virtually attend a baby. Well, I'd never been to a baby gender revealing party either. So these were all new things to me. And so anyway, but it was exciting. It was fun, and everybody enjoyed it, and they all loved it. And that was really cool. And what was the thing about the whole deal is that they had a problem, and they solved a problem. Now, as a scientist, I have like 233 inventions with Walmart, and as a scientist, we always try and start with what's the problem we're trying to solve. So you need to think, what are your problems? And what problems do you and your friends have? Do your friends have the same ones? Is the problem global? Is it local? Is it cultural? Is it social? Here's some of the mistakes and things that people succeeded and missed. Let me ask you a couple questions here. What did email solve that the US Postal Service did not? What problem did instant messaging, texting, chat, Snapchat, all that solve that email did not? What did Facebook solve that MySpace missed? And what problems has Google solved? Where are they heading now? What did the iPhone solve that BlackBerry missed? What did Amazon solve with one click? What did Uber solve that the yellow cab missed? In each one of these things, there's like a continuing thread that you can see that simplicity to the user was the key factor. So where are we going? Where are we traveling? We're looking to get into understanding more about analytics to understand the people, environments, and situations that we're in order to be able to have product closer to the people so that they don't have to travel as far. We're looking at disrupting mobility solutions that provide, sustainability, electric-driven vehicles, electric delivery vehicles. Everything hinges also on autonomous driving and flight with intelligent solutions. interaction between self-drive vehicles, bikes, lockers, carts, and UAS. What problems does autonomous driving solve? If you ask my children, I can text and drive. 3D models. What does that help with? What problem does that solve? Well, most of the time when you're using a GPS system and maps and such, you're looking at it from a horizontal perspective. But there's also the vertical perspective that we need to grasp. And then we also are looking into the Internet of Things in order to be able to understand inconvenience and lack of time. And we're looking at head-mounted opticals in order to get our hands free so that we can do more picking, packing, loading, driving without having to have our hands busy. They can focus on what they really should be doing. And then we're also looking into geolocation and beaconing type technologies so that the self-autonomous driving vehicles can have a self-awareness as to where they are and to be able to move around. And then also so our customers can be able to know where things are and how to move around throughout the different locations. So if you're working on any of these type of areas, that's the thing that I'm interested in and that I would really like to talk with you. 4 problems. Look back to Maslow's basic needs. Look at the first 4 things: human survival, safety needs, love and belonging, esteem, respect. That's the things that we're looking as problems to solve. We're working on solutions with a mix of the of the technologies I've kind of mentioned to solve these complex problems. And we want to see trends, but we also want to determine our destiny by solving future problems now.
Thank you so much, Don. Our next speaker is MIT's own Sertac Karaman. Come on up.
So much. It's such a nice event, a great mixture of people. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks to the organizers. A little bit of my background. I'm an assistant professor here at MIT. I am directing the Foundations of Autonomous Systems Technology group. We're one of the roughly 30 MIT research groups focusing on research in robotics. And my group particularly focuses on planning algorithms as well as autonomous vehicles. When I say autonomous vehicles, I mean vehicles in the sense that drones or cars and so on. But I'll talk to you a little bit about a few samples from my trajectory as I start here at MIT and going forward. And I'll tell you some examples, give you some examples about the autonomous cars domain. So I actually started here as a faculty in 2012. So I've been here as a faculty for 3 years. But I actually started as a graduate student in 2007. And since then, I've been working on autonomous vehicles. The first thing we started working on was the DARPA Urban Challenge. You may have heard of this. The DARPA called out this challenge to build a fully autonomous car that can navigate completely autonomous with no human intervention in urban traffic. It was our first entry to this DARPA challenges. There were a couple more before. So we built a fully autonomous car to go into the race. This was the first thing that we tried in terms of autonomous vehicles. Then you may know, but some of the people actually, when we were working on this, some of the people actually went to the Stanford team and some of the CMU team went to Google to build a Google car. We stayed here at MIT to build this autonomous forklift. I wonder if there's going to be a sound for this as the video. Okay, there's some sound. So this was a fully autonomous forklift just 2 years later that you can actually talk to it. You can take a megaphone and say, forklift, come to this area, and it will go to that area fully autonomously. You have a handheld tablet. At that time, in 2009, we were using Nokia tablets. And you would see the front camera image, and you would circle, for example, a pallet, and it will pick that up. There's a few things, but I'm going to skip it. And after that, I started a couple years later in Singapore. We started working on autonomous golf carts. We were thinking at the time that autonomy can really impact mobility on demand. For example, if cars were to be able to go to their next customers, it would make mobility much more available. So we started working on these. The idea was to build an autonomous car much more cheaply. And finally, today, I think Kent Larson showed a little bit, currently collaborating with Kent, Ryan, and some of the other people from CTL as well. We're working on this autonomous tricycle. And imagine this to be like an Uber-like service. You call it, it comes on the bike lanes, you hop on it, you drive wherever wherever you want to go, you just pedal it. And we're also thinking that maybe off-peak times it can also deliver packages. So there are many things that I can tell you about these, but let me highlight a few things. One thing is the kind of sensors and computers that we're using. Let me focus on the computers. The MIT entrance in the Dark Urban Challenge, our car, just for the computers, we had a server stack that had 40 CPUs and 40 gigs of RAM. We got it from Quanta Computer. It was a server computer, like it was a web server. It cost about $100K, just the computers. The total car was about $500,000. Then for the forklift, we went to 4 powerful laptops. That was about $15K. And then for the golf cart, we went to 2 desktop computers. And finally, the tricycle, we're using just 2 powerful embedded computers that are introduced by NVIDIA that I'm going to talk about in a second. So you can see the cost of just the computing goes down very quickly. I can tell you the cost of sensing that goes down very quickly as well. I can tell you the compute power. You can see that the computers, they seem to become more cheaper and sort of more affordable. But what's happening is that the compute power is almost the same, maybe even a little bit better. And there are many more recent developments in both the software and the hardware area. One of them is, in the software area, particularly advances in machine learning, statistics, artificial intelligence is one of them. Just this week was an amazing week. Google announced that they're open sourcing their AI engine, so people can look at it, peek at it, and use it. And that is one thing that will disrupt autonomy. Not just mobility, but autonomy to start with. Another thing is on the hardware. There's a lot of embedded computers that use massively parallel computing architectures. In particular, just 2 days ago, NVIDIA actually introduced some chip that they call TX1. This would be something that if we were to use 1 or 2, we would make a vehicle, put some really nice autonomy capabilities on a vehicle, and it's on the size of a credit card. It's actually on the computational power is maybe 2, 3, or maybe up to 10 or so laptop computers. So there's a lot of enablers, I think, and drivers for a portable autonomy. So there are a lot of things that will impact autonomy. This starts with societal things like insurance or vehicle sharing. And it also includes things like electrification so that autonomy becomes a little bit more easier to do. It also includes things like maybe we don't imagine right now, like things like cloud computing. You can get some data, put it on the cloud, and do inference there, and you can put it back to the car if you have some fast networks. I think that some of the most important things right now is that we have some sort of a technology that's developing, and it's developing very quickly. The question is, where can we apply it to? There are many properties of a variety of markets, but one thing you can think about is the speed of the autonomous cars and the complexity of the environment that they're working in. For example, if you're working in logistics, like some distribution centers, you want to put autonomous cars there, they'll be working a little bit fast, but the complexity of the environment is low. So you can put markers on the environment and so on. That becomes an easier problem. Maybe university campuses, you're going a little bit slower, but it's a much more complicated environment. If you're driving on the bike lanes, it's even slower, but then you have to interact with traffic and things like that. It makes it complicated. So I think it's very hard to predict where we're going to go next, but I really feel like the technologies will be developing very quickly, and the winners will be those that identify the right markets for these kind of technologies and enable autonomy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sertac. Our next speaker is a man of many titles, many positions, including former food truck operator, transport chief, advisor to many, and now author. Gabe Klein, please come on up.
Thank you. So normally I think I do have a unique background, but in this crowd, I don't know. It's great to see so many old friends, Susan Shaheen, all the Zipcar folks, Transit Screen. I mean, we have quite a mix of people in this room, NACTO. And the reason I wrote this book, Startup City, was that I really believe we can bridge the public-private divide, if you will. What Michael and Dan were talking about this morning, I agree with both of them. And I think it's going to be essential if we want to make the change that we want in cities. I'm going to dive right in, because I have a lot to talk about in 4.5 minutes. But basically, I've been thinking for a long time that this is all happening much faster than we typically would think, because of what Sertac went over, because of the computing power, because of the advancement in business models. When I left government at the end of 2013 and started to go out and publicly talk about technology and mobility and policy in cities, Elon Musk had said, hey, we're going to have some version of self-driving cars within 3 years. Then a year later, he said, actually, we're going to have it in 3 months. And then a few weeks ago, they just downloaded it to the cars, and it's now readily available if you have a Tesla built after October 2014. I also work with Fontinalis partners, and one of the co-founders is Bill Ford, and I got to talk to him about this, and he said, look, we're going to weave these technologies together over time and build an autonomous vehicle. But it'll happen pretty quickly, and they're aware that the needs in cities are very different than in the suburbs or in rural areas. And in Europe, for instance, this is a big selling point, and I actually have a new Volvo, and it actually does stop. I tested it. I almost crashed through the windshield. But the car companies also plan to move very quickly and have these technologies on the road. Many of them don't actually know what the business models are going to look like, which is fascinating when you talk to them. At the end of the day, though, it's interesting for me to look at these vehicles, including Elon Musk's new 6,000-pound Model X with the gull-wing doors, because it's really not, to me, a car built for cities. It's a car built for people to come from the suburbs into the city, which is really an old paradigm. And when you look at what's happening in Asia, which we talked about earlier, over 26 years, they understand density, they understand high-capacity transit, and they're making some other mistakes. But basically, they get this concept. And we've known about this for a long time, but until people like Jeanette were in New York, I was in DC, and there were a lot of people working in cities and telling people, no, we can do this. We can actually do this. So when you look at what Silicon Valley is doing, what's fascinating is that they don't have the legacy issues with engineers, and they don't have the supply chain and all of that. So they're basically starting from scratch, and they're negating the driver. I was just in Austin. They're testing the vehicles there, and they're building something, by the way, that's much smaller and urban scale. I think that this is going to happen much faster than people think because it's driven by the private sector, not the public sector. Because I've met with NHTSA, I've met with people at the White House, and many of you probably have too, and they will tell you they don't plan on really regulating this technology unless there's a problem. And so, and this is a couple years old, but consumers actually are ready for the technology, and they don't even know what it is. But they know that they'd rather be doing something else besides driving their car. And they actually say they feel like their kids would be safer driving with an automated vehicle than with them. So what's also interesting, and back when I was at Zipcar, we did a market segmentation. We looked at what do empty nesters want? What do millennials want? Or Gen Y at the time. This is back in like 2004. They wanted pretty much the same things. They don't want to mow the grass. They want a grocery store in their building. They want a bar down the street. People want simplicity, and this adds to their simplicity. So I think actually some of the forecasts out there are not taking into account business models like Lyft or Bandwagon or other things, because they're still thinking that people are going to be buying cars. But as we re-urbanize at the rates that I was putting up earlier, I don't think that people will be buying cars in cities. And I think we'll look back at this period of, let's say, late 1920s to now, and we'll say that was weird, when people were buying cars and driving around themselves and running over 1.24 million, or there are 1.24 million people that die on the roads every year. It's insane. In 2012, we were the first city in the US that came out with a Vision Zero plan, and I knew then that we could re-engineer our streets, we could educate people, but without technology, and we put a big automated enforcement program in place, but without this type of technology, getting the human out of the equation, we would not be able to make the change. So some people think this sounds crazy, particularly people that live in areas where the car is king. But there are a lot of crazy things that we have to change. In 2013, it was the first year we had the same number of deaths, or more deaths by guns than traffic, 32,000 each. So there's some big cultural obstacles that technology can actually help us potentially address. And I think some forms of lower quality transit in low density areas, this technology can help when we can actually operate in convoys. I think services that want to partner with the public sector and maybe not fight the public sector as much also have an opportunity. And what I worry about is that I just don't think, particularly big organizations, whether they're private or public, are really ready for the scope and the pace of the change. And I love this slide because it's from 1982. But they're not ready for the for the change that's getting ready to happen. And so having worked 3/4 of my career in the private sector, a quarter in the public sector, and learning a lot on both sides, I really do think there's a way to align our incentives so that we can get the place that we want. And with self-driving cars, it's fascinating. Like, you have companies saying, can we get some standard rules across the country? We have states that are basically in charge of those rules. So our city is going to be at the table, where 2/3 of the population is, and who have a big opportunity to benefit. I think all of us are going to have to rethink how a lot of things that we consider sacred are going to work in the future. But with the death of some things, the opportunity to experiment and the excitement of the future can take hold. Entire businesses will either morph and change or will completely go away because they won't be needed in this new world. Volvo, I think Mercedes, and Google have all said they're willing to self-insure under certain conditions. And there are also other opportunities. We store, as was talked about earlier, so many vehicles in cities. We could get rid of parking. We could actually have true equity if we upzoned housing and storage of people and downzoned storage of cars or got rid of it, and the government got involved. We actually could create an affordable housing account for every building. There are other things I think we have to consider that I don't have time to talk about because I'm out of time. But there are other things that are going to change the way we shop, change the activation of our streets, which scares me a little bit. There's new types of farming. Goldman Sachs just put $500 million into this company that'll be building farms in cities. Energy will be free. We'll stop propping up the utilities, and energy will be free, which is, I think, very exciting. And the way that we move and work will change as a result. And it sounds scary, but in the next decade and a half, digital technology will dissolve the concept of work as we know it, according to McKinsey and The Economist. And we have the opportunity to get rid of car ownership. So we're moving from a hyper-consuming economy and way of life to a collaborative way of life. I don't have time to talk about this, but public and private were essential in Zipcar's growth, I think in a lot of these new companies' growth. But the car, we can't focus too much on the car, because when you look at what's happening in Europe, they're getting rid of the car in their course. And so the car is just a means, or the automated car is just a means to an end. But the cities that are safe, that people actually want to be in, that they want to spend time, they want to shop, they want to do all the things that make a city livable, those will be the successful cities. And there are simple things that we need to do as well, and automation will help us to accomplish these. But essentially, and the reason I wrote the book, is I think that this is absolutely essential, true public-private partnership, not just financial public-private partnership, but actual understanding, shared goals and incentives. And this is a big business. So we need to embrace the future, embrace this business, but not focus too much on this, because it's just a means to an end. And if we do focus on that, we could end up with this dystopic future, or we could end up, I think, with a more livable future. I'm just going to end there, because I am way over time. Thank you.
5 minutes are done for now. Thank you so much, Gabe. Our final speaker of this block is David Mahfouda of Bandwagon IO. David, come on up.
Okay, so thanks everyone. My name is David Mahfouda. I'm the founder and CEO of Bandwagon Taxi Share. So I want to thank Gabe for ending off on that great note, talking, because it's really in the room. Like there's a possibility for a real dystopic future for us. So I want to start out with that. And so I want to ask, has anyone seen the movie WALL-E? I think many of us have. And I think, I want to start by talking about why I'm working on what I'm working on. Then I'll tell you a little bit about Bandwagon, and then talk about some influential technologies that I see. But really, the reason I got interested in shared mobility is because I think this is a future that needs to be avoided at all costs. We need to continue to rely on each other. We need to continue to be able to interface with one another as humans. I think that's the purpose of cities. Cities are machines that facilitate meetings and interactions with other people. And we're more powerful. We're more powerful as a species when we can interact with one another. And so one of the things that I got really upset about was the fact that cars were degrading our human power. They were getting in the way. They were breaking. They break our interfaces. They degrade public space. And so I want to be clear that a car is a technological device, but it is a cultural artifact. We tell stories about cars. Our understanding of our individuality and how we relate to other people is derivative of our material of our material reality. And so in the past, cars were designed to hold nuclear families. We made too many of them, but the material legacy remained, and so we ended up with all this excess capacity. But the question is, what is our family now? What do we want the human family to look like in the future? And that is why I work on what I work on. Okay, so what is Bandwagon? Bandwagon is a smart taxi sharing service. We make it really easy for passengers to meet one another at high density transportation hubs and get to where they're going with less expense, less greenhouse gas emissions. So fundamentally what we do is broker agreements. We make it really easy for people to collaborate, to connect, and to get where they're going more effectively and efficiently. It's really simple. Passengers enter their destinations. They get matched up if they're headed to the same destination. We can reduce queues for airports, attendees, and passengers, save a lot of time, and then we also work with brands to sort of support this whole interaction. And something that's really interesting about our model is that we actually don't work with drivers, right? So we're really just about facilitating human-to-human interaction, and we can create significant savings as a result. Bandwagon just 6 months ago signed a contract with the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey to run taxi sharing from LaGuardia Airport, facilitating solving a problem, a distribution problem from that location. In a couple of weeks, we're going to expand to JFK. So we're building up a lot of momentum around this product, and we're really excited about it. So that's what I do. And I told you why I do it. And so now I want to talk a little bit about some other stuff that I see out in the market that I think is really interesting. And really these are just questions that are meant as conversation starters. So we talked a little bit about urbanism, why people are moving to cities. We're at the Media Lab. Media and storytelling is so important. Young people are moving to cities not because of Uber. People moved to cities before Uber. Young people started moving to dense urban environments before Uber. Why? Because we were taught that that was how you live in community. We were taught that that is what it meant to be a person. And Sesame Street did that in the 70s and 80s. And so we got to be really clear about what kinds of stories we're telling our youth, what kinds of stories we're telling each other about how we want to live, because they matter. They really, really matter. And the technology is derivative of the stories that we tell about our lives. And this is case in point. This is why urbanization is happening in the United States. Additionally, so why can people live in cities, and why can people live in smaller footprints, in smaller apartments? It's because we don't have as much physical stuff. Right? We were taught to, so previously we were taught to consume objects. There are new pieces of media that are teaching us to consume in totally different ways that have completely different implications for how we interact in physical space. We need less space because of digital media, and that's incredibly powerful and really affecting the way that we live in cities and the technologies that we're able to utilize and believe and inhabit as people. This is another example. So we have search on the web, and now we have search in real life. It's the same structure that's sort of facilitating a new way of understanding what it means to be human, a new way of navigating the world and being alive. And then just want to continue to push on this theme. This is a transportation technology. VR is a mobility technology. Transportation is media. Media is transportation. So if we want to talk about things that are what's the next 10 years going to look like, and how the next 10 years what is going to affect the future of mobility in the next 10 years, sure, autonomous vehicles, but this is another mobility device. And this is so scary to me. It's really exciting, but this is a big deal for mobility. And I just want everyone to be clear that we're not just talking about autonomous vehicles. There are other really major transformative technologies that we're dealing with. I don't know what these are. Have you ever seen these? I have no idea what they are. They're amazing. Like the kids that ride on these are incredible. They're so beautiful. They're so beautiful. I have no idea what's going to happen when my kids like want these and use these exclusively and don't know. Like, this is going to change. This is going to change who we are. This is going to change who we are as people. Okay, so just want to leave you with one question, right? So Greg asked a great question. What are we doing? Why are we here? What are we talking about? I think we live in cities because we need other people, because we're more powerful as people when we work together, when we interface with each other. And part of the question of new mobility is, are we going to make the human family bigger, or are we going to make it smaller? Thanks.
I'll take that. Thank you so much, David. All right, my fellow speaker panelists, please come on up. Let's take some seats. That was really great. What happens when people do forget to walk? I've wondered that too with the hoverboards. I would say I think I might be under NDA by telling you this, but I literally am going to a panel presentation, going to an internal workshop where I was literally asked by one of the consultants, what if we could make hoverboards that actually flew? They were trying to actually get back to the Future technology. So there's still that thinking that this is what we really need. But I want to get into, before we get into, I think, some of the really interesting unintended consequences of this, which was, to me, one of the great themes of all of your presentations, I was hoping we could take a step back and I think talk a little bit more about the realities of impending autonomy of this. Because, I mean, speaking of media and media dominating the reality, I think when people think about autonomy, we're still thinking about the Google cars. We're thinking about the one that Gabe showed with an $80,000 LiDAR, 3D LiDAR system on top, which is very expensive. And we know the technology is cheaper and there's alternatives to that are enabling very, very fast change. So Guy, I want to ask you the first question on this, because beforehand you were telling me that you guys are working on an autonomous operating system on building kits to retrofit cars into autonomy. I was hoping you could talk a bit about, I guess, what you could see in the near term away from the Google producing its own brand of autonomous car to a landscape with a lot more heterogeneous and small scale change going on.
Yeah, so we've launched actually an operating system. The company is Harbrick. That it takes care of 85% of the programming needed for autonomy, so it reconciles all of that massive amount of data from any configuration of camera and sensors. And next year will probably be available on a chip. And what we did when we launched was we have offered a non-commercial license for free to every university in the country. And so we get calls from teams of kids, basically, who are retrofitting their car into an autonomous vehicle in the garage. And then you've got solid-state LiDAR coming out. I mean, what all of this means is that a $10,000 sensor could be on the market for $150 or $75 within 12 months. Mm-hmm. And so we're working with freight, we're working with transit systems, we're working with buses, and working with some insurers that have decided to embrace this and make sure that it's safe and that people can afford to take a higher degree of risk in the experimentation. And so that of course causes a self-reinforcing cycle that increases the capability and drives down the cost.
But I'd say, and as a follow-up to that real fast, I mean, is this something where I will take my car in to get the oil changed and I will come out with an autonomous car? I mean, is that sort of the future we're going to in 5 years as the technology gets simpler and easier to implement?
I think we'll get to that point. Mm-hmm. There's no reason not to.
All right.
Yeah, I think something to think about with respect to autonomous vehicles is agency and human agency. To what extent are humans making decisions and thinking creatively about how they get to where they're going? I drove up to Boston following Waze the entire way last night. In that situation, I'm just an actuator. I'm a machine that is following directions from an artificial intelligence. So in a lot of ways, autonomous vehicles are here already. And I think one of the things that's really important in thinking about autonomy is thinking about human agency and thinking about to what extent people are making decisions and solving problems, and to what problems we want people to be able to solve, and what problems we want machines to solve.
Yeah.
And it's already the case that the problems that machines are solving with respect to mobility is increasing and increasing. So I just want to be clear about that.
But there's a tremendous amount of problems still. I mean,
Yes.
We've got 40% of fatalities, I think, are alcohol-related and drug-related. Fatalities are about a $1.3 trillion problem in the United States, like fully loaded cost, which is like 8% of GDP. It's like 6 trillion globally. So while we are solving some of them with things like Waze, fundamentally, like, people are not computers, and we fall down, we have too many martinis, you know, and then go pick up our kids. You know, there's all kinds of bad things that happen when the human is involved. And I think removing that makes a tremendous amount of sense if we're going to have this distributed mobility system.
No, I mean, I agree. We can debate this in the Q&A, audience Q&A, but I mean, I definitely think, set the technical issues aside, I think autonomy is definitely going to happen, because I think the narrative around the fact that we can save 1 million lives is an incredibly powerful one, and one that Google can sell, particularly to the states and lobbying for driver's license. It's a very, very powerful narrative, which is fascinating to know the automakers are getting into this and effectively admitting, oh, our product have killed millions of people for years, but now we're going to have our own autonomous cars. But
Yeah, two other parts, because it's a three-legged stool, right? With the shared mobility and with the autonomy combined, it's also legitimately the first opportunity we've had to reverse greenhouse gas.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, realistically, we are at that doorstep for the first time in human history. And it's going to happen through transportation. So that's the second leg. And the third leg on this is it increases the capacity to be not just happier and more efficient, but more social. I mean, when you have 3 or 4, 5, 6, 10 people in a vehicle and nobody has to worry about operating it, then you have a much more social environment. And I want to, I mean, it's not exactly controversial to agree with Gabe, but I want to reinforce a point. I think most of the prognostications and forecasts are way off because they don't take into account how all of these things reinforce each other.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, I want to step back and I want to talk about some of the potentially unintended consequences of this. So the project that I've enjoyed most enjoyed working on in the last year or so was a project done again at NYU at Rudin. Anthony Townsend was the principal author. It was called Reprogramming Mobility, where we as researchers looked at all the sort of current weak signals, and then Anthony basically ran off and scoped out a number of dystopian futures of this. One of which was imagining one in Los Angeles in 2028. A world in which Google did not roll out a perfectly compatible autonomous fleet, but the automakers rushed much faster than anyone thought. They brought out their own autonomous systems, which had massive interoperability issues. And so this LA of 2028 is one in which there are apocalyptic traffic jams because the 17 different car makers are working out their differences in real time on the highways. And so epic congestion. Families don't see each other. In fact, they get home at 11 o'clock at night and they let the kids sleep in the autonomous car before they get back behind the wheel at 4 a.m. All sorts of things like this, where this incredibly heterogeneous environment leads to much greater complexity, as Gabe pointed out in his slide. So I want to ask all of you, what are the unintended consequences? What is the future that not? Because I think we also saw consensus possible futures of this. WALL-E's one of the dystopias, but I'm curious, what other potential dystopias could we stumble into, or what's going to happen here with a much more heterogeneous environment than I think any of us really has understood to date? Anyone? Yes.
Well, I'll just say that I agree with everything you said, and that's why I'm working on all this stuff, because I don't want to see what happened in the 1950s when we got rid of the streetcars and we sort of destroyed our cities. And you look at when the population started to drop off everywhere from Cincinnati to Washington, D.C., it was literally the day the streetcars went away, right? So if we create these horrible places that nobody wants to be and just trade one kind of auto congestion for another, it's a disaster. But I'm hopeful because of organizations like NACTO, actually, that are engaging on this issue. I'm hopeful because I think some of the companies that are working on it actually do want to work for the greater good. I hope. I think that like people like Ashley Hand and Peter Marks that are here from LA are very engaged. Like LA's got somebody devoted to this topic, and they're working on a strategy. So I think there's more coordination between cities, in particular, as well as states. And maybe the federal government's not getting too involved, but I think there's much more going on behind the scenes that people are aware of. So I hope that doesn't happen. But I think we are very much at a crossroads.
But I do agree with that, actually. So from a technical standpoint, I think that, like, for example, autonomous cars that are different and they cause a traffic jam, I think that's technically unlikely, but I think it's almost the other way around, where they're so coordinated and they're so efficient that we deploy them massively. And you go out, all these cars, they kind of look very much in coordination, but they just transform cities into a place where it just doesn't look nice, doesn't look livable. People maybe want to move outside the city or something like that. Those kind of things could happen, I think.
Well, Sertac, could you talk a bit more about sort of the implementation map you showed? That to me was your most interesting slide in imagining that. So what's a plausible future in the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years for how we're going to actually see autonomy implemented in a sane, safe, responsible way? Not, by the way, what you forgot to mention, Gabe, is the final step in your Elon Musk progression there, where they did release the autonomy, and now Elon Musk is on analyst calls saying, I'm sure you've seen the crazy YouTube videos. This is not good. And they're going to start restraining some of the autonomy features of this. So yeah, Sertac, what's an easy, safe way to do this?
So I get asked that a lot, first of all. It's hard to guess. I should say that outright. It's very hard to guess what it is. I showed you 2 dimensions about speed and complexity. There are many more, like regulation and policy is another one. There's just some places that are very highly regulated, like streets, and there's some places like, I don't know, a distribution center for a company that's just, you can do whatever you want, basically, and that's a different, there are 2 extremes. So it's very hard to see what it is. But from a technical point of view, fully autonomously driving outside, we need to do a lot of research to get that done, just from technically. I mean, I don't think that, you could put a lot of money into it and you could build the most expensive car, you put it out there, it won't be able to drive fully autonomously in full traffic. There are a variety of reasons for that. For one thing is that we can teach computers with the new advances in machine learning and so on. We can teach them basically pattern recognition, like the very simple primitive of being intelligent. We can teach them that. We can teach them that this is a car, and every time they see it, they perfectly recognize it. So we can do those kind of things. But then our options are anything that is in context. We can teach them that. We can teach them cars, pedestrians, and so on. But I was listening to a talk by Sebastian Tron, who was leading the Google's effort, and he was asked, do you get any problems? And he was describing a situation where there was a couch in the highway, and the car in front of them pulled out at the last second, and now the car is looking at an object that has no idea what it is. So you, as a human, you know what a couch is because you don't only drive. You go home and you see couches and you know what that is, and you'll say, some weird person dropped a couch on the highway, whatever, I'll just throw it away. But then the robot is looking at it, and is it a painting on the road, or is it some object? Is it a car? It doesn't look like it, so it doesn't know what it is. That's the fundamental question. So it's actually a big philosophical question whether we need to make general AI to be able to drive on the road. General AI meaning like a human simulation, put it that way. There are papers on philosophical journals on that. But going back, I think there are a number of things that we can conquer very quickly. And further ahead, it's hard to see. I think what will happen is that in terms of moving people, there's big stakes in the game. A lot of companies will try that very hard. And it may look like I don't know if you guys seen the Verizon map, as it's, you start from little pockets and pieces, and it kind of grows and it covers everywhere. Like, I wouldn't be very surprised if, 3 to 5 years, maybe 10 years, I don't know, Google does a mountain view implementation of their cars or something like that. I think that'll be the progression. But it's very hard to guess. Like I said, it's very hard to know.
Yeah. Well, one area in this, Don, I want to ask you a bit about sort of, I know you can't speak totally for Walmart, but I do have to ask you sort of Walmart's take on this, considering that one possible future of this, or one possible implementation in a serious way, is logistics pathway. Rather than creating autonomous vehicles for people, what about creating more autonomous systems to bring things to us? The last week, I don't know if you've seen the current entrant, or the newest entrant is Starship by 2 former Skype engineers, where they've developed a small robot size of a small refrigerator, it looks like, that can hold 2 bags of groceries and can deliver up to a mile. So in that sense, you can have accessibility, mobility in the sense of bringing things brought to you. So how is Walmart sort of looking at this? Or what do you think are the major issues from like autonomous logistics and how they might be deployed in various ways?
Yeah, so when we look at this, we are looking at what problems we're trying to solve, and that's exactly it. So if you ask the questions, what was interesting to me when I heard the different speakers speak was we all were talking about solving problems and problems that occur, and so what's the problem that we face? What's the problem that everybody faces in any type of thing like this? And that is making sure that products are closest to the people and being able to get those to the people fastest. And so what's the fastest way to do that? And so that's why we look at this as a very, very good possibility for us. This is a possible solution, because right now, how long does it take to move a product to you?
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, I mean, in that regard, because that reminds me of something in the sense of, do you see this being incorporated into the big supply chains? I mean, is this something where we could see at scale if Walmart chooses to drive this? I bring this up because there was a great piece that Fast Company wrote recently where basically argued that the sharing economy, the true sharing economy in the sense that it was originally formed, was dead. And the best way they described it was everything about it was great except that nobody gave a shit. And the reason is because you can get an Amazon Prime membership, and if you want to drill, the famous example of a drill, something you rarely use, it's still cheaper and easier than to simply just go hit one-click purchase on Amazon and have the entire Amazon supply chain system bring you that drill and put it in a closet than it was to work out the transaction cost of negotiating with your neighbors through these systems and sharing that drill. And there was profoundly despairing peace that way. And so
So what I was excited to hear today, especially from the other speakers, and I think wasn't it you that talked about the 3D printing, and you also talked about the virtual reality. Who was that? You? Okay.
Me, 3D printing.
Sorry, I have a very short-term memory. So, but I don't think very well on my feet, so that's why I'm glad we're sitting down. But that is all part of the logistics too,
right?
And that all plays a huge role in the future, is the way I see it. Now, that's just the way I see it personally. I see all that mixing in together. So when we look at a lot of this stuff, we look at it as an individual, piece. And that's really all it is just a small part. The autonomous bike, the autonomous car, the virtual reality. It's all a part of a big system overall that needs to be put together. And that's going to be the secret.
Yeah, we'll follow on that. Gabe, you asked Guy, please.
I just want to say that there's an old saying in the transportation field that or the urban planning field, that a good transportation plan is really a good land use plan. And I think it's interesting to look at what's going to happen in the future with 3D printing and with holographic imaging and VR, because you can rapidly see a world where people are printing a certain percentage of the stuff in their house versus getting it shipped if it's easier, because it comes down to cost and hassle. If you can eliminate cost and hassle, people will mass adopt typically, right? And so if that starts to change, and if automated cars are just the front end of automation of a whole lot of stuff, and we work less, and I don't want to get too off subject, but it really does affect how much people move. And I think if you look at that world versus the world that we live in, transit-oriented development still works, because people are going to want to live, work, and play in one place and have all of the amenities that they want there, and high-capacity transit to get somewhere when they do need to leave.
I do agree with that, and I want to expand that. I want to hear from everyone on this, because to me it's interesting when you said it's all part of a system. That's true to some extent. When imagining VR, and imagining logistics, and imagining autonomous cars, and imagining walkable TOD, but they're not all going to be equal. Someone's going to control that narrative and control the form of that. And just as streetcars and cars should have coexisted, instead GM played somewhat of a role in destroying them in Los Angeles, et cetera, et cetera. And all these aspects have a narrative to them, and they have a politics and economics to them. I mean, I think of Uber today. To me, the scariest scenario about Uber and transportation network companies is that that Uber 2015 is Walmart 1985. At which point, people could still say, "Oh, I have a great walkable downtown, but there's this new store. It's cheap. It's got this huge selection, and it's not hurting anything if I use it." And then we see tremendous downstream consequences. So I'm curious about, I'd love to hear from each of you your fears or your hopes for this about, will we end up with a VR-dominated future where mobility is, transportation is media, mobility is the ability to access services virtually, or TOD, how do we assert the right of walkable TOD, or how these various autonomous systems will be put to use, or how we might see them misused. I mean, no one talked about autonomous cars until Google announced it in 2010, and now they've spent tremendous amounts of money lobbying. So it's this dominant narrative that here we are discussing it. So I'd like to hear about thoughts. How do we assert the various things that we want, and how do we dissuade the futures that we don't want from happening out of these scenarios? Don,
Well, you have to be careful, first of all, that you don't make the world your world. I mean, there are a whole lot of people out there, okay? And each of you have, your own preferences. And the thing is that there's not one size that fits all in this whole mobility thing. Everybody's going to expect something different. And that's one of the things that we're experiencing, is you can't just come out with one solution for everybody. There are lots and lots of different ways. I personally hate to drive, but I have another person with me who loves to drive. So for me, driving is a loss of time that I could be using to do something else, and I'm very much mobile and active in everything I do. So I mean, that's my answer. Is you need this overall system to make this all work together for people who are weird like me and people who are normal like everybody else.
I think there's no question that Google essentially launched a moon race, and in that respect, in terms of showing us what's possible, they performed a tremendous service, and they're on a very defined, somewhat kind of growth path. Where it could backfire if we let it is that all of a sudden the regulatory community or in the insurance industry and the oil industry all of a sudden had to react to a car. And so immediately the focus was too myopic. Now is the time, before this gets too much farther, to step back. And that's why I say the question is, what do you want from a mobility system? Because the true exponential potential of all this is by stepping back and examining the application of mobility in the context of our daily lives. And that sounds awfully warm and fuzzy and kind of weird to suggest as a regulatory starting place, but that's where the questions have to start getting asked. Otherwise, we are going to end up with 4 times the number of vehicles that we have, because everybody's going to be making money off their over the car that they can own but not drive and send out to you when you call it. So the driverless Uber, where somebody's still getting paid for owning a car that's low occupancy, is kind of the worst, one of the worst things that could happen here. So we really have to, now is the time, and there's a couple of states that are starting, Florida, there's a couple of states that are starting to step back and ask the question. But it is very much about a holistic view and taking the urban planning and figuring out what we want to do with this technology, how we want to apply the technology of mobility. And in that respect, I would say shared mobility up to date has actually been more disruptive and more exponential than what we've accomplished in robotics, artificial intelligence, and autonomy.
And also take this. Well, David, I have a question for you in this, in terms of especially the social aspect of it, and regarding sociability. And Gabe, you might want to dive in on this too. But I haven't had a chance to use Bandwagon, but I'm really curious about the actual the use of it, the social norms that are being built up around this, because it's really interesting. Because you're really doing a social engineering experiment, which is basically teaching New Yorkers who are extremely angry at LaGuardia cab lines, and extremely angry when you cut them in LaGuardia cab lines. How are people finding each other, and how are people accepting the use of that? Because you have this sort of illegible, invisible transaction where suddenly these strangers are high-fiving each other and jumping the line. And I'm curious, like, how do they communicate that this is a legitimate thing, that this is a regulated thing, that this is okay and it's cool?
Yeah. So it's one of the benefits of building a service. What Bandwagon does is act as a broker. And so we sort of govern the entire transaction, and we make sure we can guarantee that passengers aren't gonna cheat one another. We can make it easy for passengers to meet one another by actually providing a physical introduction. They really enjoy meeting each other. I think it's actually a misnomer about New Yorkers that they are bad at sharing. That's one of the things that is the best about New York, is that most everyone rides the subway. Most everyone is actually really good at working and interacting in very close physical proximity. And so I think people that live in New York are actually are already habituated to sharing. And you talked earlier about transaction costs in the sharing economy, so I actually disagree with you. I think the transaction costs associated with sharing are going to continue to come down. And that's one of the things that we've focused a lot on Bandwagon in order to make the interaction at the front of the taxi line at LaGuardia and soon JFK as painless as possible, as fast as possible. And I think with more technologies that will be able to help everyone identify where objects are in physical space at all times, that will be another layer of reducing the transaction costs associated with sharing objects that are lower value. So I think transaction costs are really important, and I think a lot of what our technologies are doing are lowering the transaction costs associated with being social, with sharing, with getting better utility out of our existing resources. And fundamentally, that's what the sharing economy. So sharing started with time sharing on computers, right? So there's this giant computer, is a tremendously valuable resource that many people needed access to. And so one of the first sharing, I guess that's what a computer is figuring out how we can use this computing power, how multiple people can share this existing computing resource. And the media is the message. If we figure out, if that's what we're figuring out with computers, is how to allocate it effectively among a lot of individuals that need computing power, computing resources, it makes sense that we're going to also use that computing resource to then figure out how to share, how to divide up. That's what sharing means, is actually to divide up. How are we going to divide up our physical resources more efficiently. And so it's completely sensical that that would be derived from what one of the initial uses of networks was.
One more question before I open up to the audience. So start thinking of questions, please. But Sertac, I want to come back to you because I had a chance. I was in Singapore a couple weeks ago and had a chance to take a ride in the Mitsubishi autonomous car, my second make of autonomous car. And it was interesting because to me the most interesting part of the experiments that MIT Smart Future Mobility is doing there is that they're basically doing live fire exercises in actual Singapore neighborhoods. So the autonomous car is going down the street. No one has been warned that they're interacting with the autonomous car, and the Singaporean government is gung-ho on this. And this, of course, is what Tesla has decided to do on a much larger scale. So I guess my question for you is, I know you're not an ethicist, but what are the ethics of such experiments and how we should roll these out in a sort of fail-safe model when we're doing it with autonomy? Because of course we want to push it as far ahead as possible, and doing it in a bubble is useless compared to the complexity of the real world. But are there ways of doing this? I'm curious if how close you are to your Singapore colleagues on how they've done this, and what do you think are really the best ways of doing this?
Yeah, in Singapore, I mean, we're definitely, we work with insurance companies and so on. So legally, we're covered. Yeah, admittedly, the technology is, we're usually testing the code that we have developed the week before. It's not like it's the first time it's running. We run it in simulations and so on, so we make sure it's working. But no simulation is as good as the real environment. And we go up there and we do the tests. And there are people who are working on the ethical issues around this. I think in general we should be much more careful of that. And there are some approaches out there that are trying to address it. For example, University of Michigan recently built like a small city of some sort that you can test your autonomous car there. We're actually hoping to take some of our effort in Singapore at one point. I'm not directly involved in that, but some of our colleagues are trying to take it there and try to test it there to see what happens. Unfortunately, it's a bit of a city that's, like everything that you can find in a city is so compactly represented there, it's not quite a city anymore, so it's very tough to go around in there. But those kind of things are, I think, the way we should introduce it. Yeah, I didn't talk about Tesla, but talking about Tesla. So Tesla does something that they call sort of level 3 autonomy. So people may be familiar with this. There's some sort of policy on this about what are the levels of autonomy that you can get. So the top level will be level 4. That would mean that imagine an autonomous car that you could safely put your kids and it would take them to daycare. So nobody would be touching anything and the car would be going fully autonomously. What Tesla is trying to do is something called level 3 autonomy. So you're fully alert. You're behind the vehicle. You're behind the wheel. If something happens, you can take over the control. That's precisely what we're doing in Singapore as well. So if something happens, we can take over control, we're alert, and there's laws for that. So you may have heard, like this, Nevada came up with these laws, and California followed, and so on, to introduce autonomous cars. That's really introducing level 3 autonomy. So it seems like these are the ways to develop the technology, and I think we should do that. We should be very careful with the ethical issues. But at the same time, this is one of those things that the technology has a bit of a network effect. So if you don't deploy it, and if you don't get the data, and if you don't work on it, it won't work. An example for that is Apple Maps. So Apple introduced their Maps application. It was horrible. I think they knew that. And people used it, and people said, this doesn't work. And they said, yes, it doesn't work. And if you use it, it'll work. Nowadays, it works OK. So it's something like that. So there's a bit of a trade-off there. We really need to go out and do these tests to make sure it works. But I guess we need to isolate some of the environments or maybe get volunteers and be more careful.
I think that's one of the biggest concerns that people have is that technology will take over and they won't be able to get their hands back on the wheel and be able to do it. And so I think that's wise. I think it's very wise on your part.
Although with Tesla, I don't think people were doing that initially. Yeah. But if you, Tesla actually, if you run the autonomy feature on your car, it shows you a one-page agreement. You agree to that. It's very vague up until the last sentence, which says, anything happens, you're responsible. So that's the last sentence. Other than that, it kind of says, you have to be behind the wheel and holding the wheel, and you have to be very careful and so on. And honestly, the Tesla cars, they don't have the best sensors, so they're working with ultrasonics and so on. I'm actually kind of really amazed. They're doing that so well with those sensors. They must have an amazing group. I know some of the people who transitioned there, and I know they're great, and I know the size of their group, so I'm sure they're working hard. But I think Elon Musk is a great guy. He's very bold to do that.
But that's I would say, I guess one more
but
question,
it's-
Guy or Sertac or someone on this. I mean, this conference is devoted to disruption, which when we use it in the conventional sort of lingo now, it portrays heroic tech entrepreneurs like Elon Musk out there to upset the status quo. And to me, I keep coming back to thinking about, I think it was Gabe who had the image of an iPhone strapped to the top of a car, which to me is like, yes, if Kevin, I believe it's Kevin Kelly or someone, the notion that essentially is, a car is chips on wheels. That's great, because I'm really looking forward to someone's, jalopy Linux box coming down the street at me that's completely unregulated, where someone's taken, Guy's tech and hacked it. Or worse, what is the equivalent of script kiddies on the road, where they basically are going to launch a DDoS on my house, Or it strikes me that there's so many potential gaps in the regulatory aspect of this. The notion of like, well, we're dealing with entities like Tesla, which is a very nice corporation, and others. But it strikes me that there is a sort of genie out of the bottle aspect to this, and I'm wondering how are we going to sort of deal with this when we could see mainstream, open source, easily implementable autonomous delivery vehicles, anything that gets out there. I mean, I think Musk, when he says that maybe we have to make this illegal because it starts to get too scary, I think he's maybe looked down the abyss a little bit. But I don't know, any thoughts on this, on what are the really nightmare scenarios?
If I can quickly say one thing. So if one of the major challenges, like I was highlighting earlier, is the out of context stuff. And one of those is the humans. I mean, you don't know what exactly they're going to do. You can try to train with data and pattern recognize what humans are trying to do, but there's going to be outliers. So clearly the problem, just from a technical point of view, so there may be a lot of societal impacts of this. So I'm not saying let's remove the humans, but clearly if you do not have any humans driving around, and it's all robots, the problem is much easier. And
in life.
So do you look at the humans as the baseline, and then you look at the intervention as the autonomous vehicle, and then you try and compare which is kind of what you did a little bit with the statistics, right?
Well, I mean, I'm much more nervous about what we have today.
Exactly.
And the level of acceptance that we have of all the death on the road. And, I walk my daughter every morning, like 6 blocks to daycare, and I'm constantly scared that she's going to get run over, because there's just so much reckless activity. You can see it at every intersection. So when you look at autonomous technology coming fast, there are these nightmare scenarios where one car could go a little nuts and drive on a sidewalk, and that would be horrible. But compared to what we have today, I just don't see any comparison.
That just happens in the Bronx on Halloween.
Right,
cars
exactly.
on the sidewalk.
But level 3 autonomy scares me because the human is still there, and the human might think he turned it on or she turned it on, but actually they turned it off and then drive into a tree. So when I rode in the Google car, I was amazed. After 3 minutes, I was just carrying on a conversation with the person next to me. And part of it is that it's a 25 mile per hour max speed. It's designed to look out for pets and bikes. It's got a rubber or a foam bumper. So it's meant for low speed travel. Going, 80 on a highway after a few drinks and thinking you have it in autonomous mode, that scares me a little.
No. All right, on that note, I want to open up the audience here for some questions. I see the first hand right there in the center, and then we'll start going to the side. So this gentleman here in the grayish coat, or brownish coat.
Thank you very much. Yasha Franklin Hodge from the city of Boston. So we talk a lot about autonomy, in particular in the urban context, and we tend to celebrate the Google car and things that in theory offer a future of electrified shared urban mobility. But in the way that autonomy has the potential to give us back the time we spend in travel, it's also easy to see a future in which autonomous vehicles end up being a force for suburbanization by making the time spent traveling long distances far less painful and problematic for people. So I want to ask a question about regulation from another angle, not safety and the nature of the rules of the road, but rather land use and the future of how we distribute ourselves across the planet. What kind of regulatory apparatus do we need to make sure that autonomy doesn't lead us to a world of increasing sprawl and suburbanization with all the attendant costs of that?
The example I think of that is the scenarios that show what a purely autonomous interchange would look like, which is essentially 12 lanes of autonomous cars enmeshed that way. I mean, complete destruction of the street. So, yeah, if anyone can take this, Gabe, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think it's a combination of regulation. It's carrots and sticks. Like, there's regulation, but you need to lead people, because market forces can show people the possibilities. I think, Kent Larson's slides were brilliant, because you go back, tens of thousands of years, or at least thousands of years, and people were operating in urban villages then. People crave the energy of other people. fundamentally. And I think when you look at what's happened in Northern Europe, which, yeah, maybe it's more socialist, right? But they've made an investment in density and high capacity, or some mixed density, high capacity public transit, bikeability, walkability. People love it, they want more, and they're willing to pay for it. So I think what we need to do in this country is a combination of great pilots and examples, which you're starting to see all over the country. I live in DC. There's so many examples of suburbs reinventing themselves as TODs. Gaithersburg, Tyson's Corner, which I thought, I'd written that off, and they are reinventing themselves. So we need some great examples. We need to show that you can actually make money doing the right thing, which you can. You can make a lot more money. And then the regulations need to reinforce that, and we need to upzone more density. We need to get rid of parking. But we need to show that there's actually more profit in that, and that's what people want. So it's this sort of trifecta.
Mm-hmm. Great. Other questions? This gentleman here in the glasses.
Philippe Christ with the International Transport Forum of the OECD. I had a question going back to the question that you asked earlier today, and that is, what is it that we're doing here? And it's a bit of a philosophical question, because I hear from the discussion that we've just had that there's this implicit assumption that by making our movement, our mobility, our transport systems easier, we're actually going to do something that's good for us. And so I would like to ask the panel, is it the case that making, in this case, our movement through our cities via automated means something that will be better for the cities fundamentally? And I ask that because we did some modeling of shared self-driving, but mainly shared systems in a mid-sized European city. We're doing it for London right now. And one of the things that came out of that is that, in fact, the number of walking trips decreased tremendously by 80%. And these are walking cities. And we know that there are health benefits and health advantages of people moving every day. So transit-oriented development that's one of the ideas that will deliver better walking. But is it the case that by making automated mobility easier, we'll actually see a decrease in some of these benefits that we're experiencing in our cities already?
Great question.
Again, it's a great question, and so let me give you a partial flip on that. Roughly 15% of the adult households in the United States are not independent. They're dependent on social welfare systems because of a lack of on-demand safe mobility. My son was a great case in point. It took a village to get him to McDonald's for a part-time job. In an urban environment where you offer up through safe on-demand shared mobility or some different form of automated mobility, the opportunity to go from being dependent on social welfare systems to an independent contributor to society, I mean, take yourselves back to your first paycheck and what that felt like. And so there are contexts like that that will have a dramatic impact on cities that we also have to weigh into account. Sure, there will be some people who will walk less. There'll be a whole lot more people who can't walk at all now that will be mobile and contributing at a societal level.
Yeah, if I can say a few words on that. So it's a great question as well. And just like it was outlined a little earlier, I mean, there are a lot of people who just cannot drive and would have loved to drive and cannot live their lives because they cannot drive. There are a lot of people who should not drive, but they still drive. And there are a lot of people who prefer not to drive so that they can do other things. So in that sense, I mean, autonomy or not, whatever it is, that making mobility more available is required for some of the society, I think. But beyond that, if you make autonomy very, very available to a point where it's just, not autonomy, but I'm sorry, to make mobility very, very available to a point where you can go from A to B very easily, that may really, in a way, change behavior. And that's how new markets open, new economic activity starts. So people change behavior, and behavior will require some other aspects. You fill that in, and there will be a new market. So I can see that if you make it more available somehow, people would get into a behavior where they may be more productive. Like all of a sudden, for instance, if I had a panel here, and if I had a meeting later in, I don't know, in the Boston City Hall, I probably would not schedule them at the same day. But if mobility was that available, I'd probably say, okay, that's a normal thing to do. So in that sense, I think there are a few nice things to make mobility more available, however you can do that.
Yeah, in my opinion, autonomous vehicles are certainly not the goal. I think what we're trying to do is create cities in which people can get their needs met.
Right.
And if you can get your needs met through land use planning and all of the resources that you need, including the people that you love and that you love to spend time with, are near you and you can walk to them, then I think that's a win for mobility. I think one of the reasons why the people on this stage are interested in autonomous mobility is because the current system is dysfunctional, right? So car ownership is destroying cities. They're getting in the way of, car ownership is getting in the way of humans getting their needs met. And shared access is a way to erode current car culture, and autonomous vehicles are a way to support shared ownership, right? So autonomous vehicles, I only care about them to the extent that they enable people to get their needs met more effectively, and they enable us to get rid of the way that we currently think about cars and the terrible, terrible effects that they're having on our cities and the way that we relate to each other.
And it's, but hold on, sorry, this is important. It's also, sorry, I know you're the moderator, but it's also about public space. Like, we use so much public space to store vehicles.
Yes.
Cars sit 95% of the time.
Yes.
You take shared mobility and you add autonomous vehicles to the equation, and you can get rid of, there are different figures, 50 to 85% of cars in cities. So what if we then got rid of, or reallocated, 50, 85% of the space away from cars? So maybe like right now there's a bike lane every 3 or 4 blocks in DC, right? Like a real bike lane. What if the car lane was every 3 blocks, and it was an autonomous HOV 3+ bus lane, and then your streets actually were turned back to people? We're people streets. I mean, those are the possibilities if we embrace this.
Well, as moderator, I get the final word on this before we go to the question. But I would say I think you're halfway to his question. I feel like what I interpret the question is we have already on this panel implicitly assumed the legitimacy of the autonomous car and improving the car as a mode of transportation by making it autonomous more effective. Should we be challenging the legitimacy of the car altogether and re-engineering the city? And that basically, I mean, let's just end this whole conference right now and do disrupting land use regulations and change it that way, which is to interpret that. So. I'm available to moderate that conference too. But let's go to some more questions because we're almost to lunch. I have a question in the back. Let's go to that. I think it's Tim Papandreou back there if I see him correctly.
Hey, Greg.
Yes.
Tim Papandreou, the city of San Francisco. I love these conversations. I have these conversations all the time, but there's a reality check that we need to have a bit of a check-in on the status of our public infrastructure and the status of our public labor situation. Much of these disruptions are going to could affect the private industry, and they have to do with the changes in labor. But once you start touching public sector union issues, that's like walking into a room with a chainsaw. So you need to be very careful about what we're stating and what we think we can do. And I love the conversation on technology, but I want to hear about what it's going to do to the labor market, number one. And number two, when our infrastructure is being disvoted on, not even voted for, but disvoted on even by the federal representative today, that gives me pause in terms of we don't even have enough painting budget to stripe our streets, let alone repave them for these new technologies. So not a disser on the technology. I think the technology is really valuable. I want to hear about the changes to the labor market and then the actual true need for public and private partnerships to make these infrastructure pieces work. Because you guys didn't show the picture, which I thought you would, which is not of WALL-E, but of Minority Report.
Yeah.
Remember you saw the Minority Report? Those 14-story high highways everywhere? That costs $1 trillion a mile. Who's going to pay for that?
Right.
Leave it to the government guy to harsh our buzz here.
I give you a live example.
Who wants to go with this? Yes. Guy, please, go first.
Yeah, I'll give you a live example. So got together with the transit agency, a reinsurer, and sat down with the union and talked to the drivers. And so looked, the technologies that we're testing in a level 3 control environment, so not jumping to 4, were based on feedback from the drivers about having a safer environment and wanting to feel safer and wanting to not hit a pedestrian, and then the loss data from the transit agency itself. And they ended up with the reinsurer providing literally significant economic incentive to adopt the technologies and test them. Now, this is on a 20-year-old bus, and we're able to virtually eliminate fatalities. That's where we're on track for right now already. Eliminating pedestrian fatalities for less than $1,500 a vehicle. So I think it's important to work with the labor force and take their voice into account. Because at the end of the day, if we have the best technology in the world, but we cannot overcome the cultural resistance to adoption, we haven't accomplished anything.
Anyone?
I'll
No?
just say,
Well, we can go more questions if you want.
okay. Well, the next 20 years are going to be painful, getting to wherever we're going. I'll just say that.
Yeah.
Yes. Gentleman in the front row. They're rushing a microphone too.
John Niles from Global Telematics in Seattle. When I hear somebody say cars are destroying cities, my first reaction is you don't get around very much. So I know you are on record, you said that. Let's hear from everybody else. I'd like to hear from Walmart if cars are destroying cities, or anybody who just wants to comment on that. It's a very provocative, interesting statement.
Who would like to take that? I mean,
So
I can take that too.
It's kind of very interesting that one thing, I was in a short visit to kind of a big company that has large logistics operations in Manhattan. And I realized that, I went to Manhattan several times. I didn't know that there were that many trucks in Manhattan just delivering, certain kinds of goods to the small businesses in Manhattan. They're everywhere. There's so many of them. If somehow you could get around, I don't know how to do that, but if you could somehow do that more efficiently and get around that, Manhattan will be much more available for people who just want to walk around there, and a lot of people do. So I think there are certain things that definitely, it's not just the car, but some of the services that we're trying to provide into the city using a car is making the city, I don't know what the term it is, but ugly or less usable at least.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think what everybody means is that, I shouldn't speak for everybody, I think that cars came close to destroying cities in the 70s, 80s, 60s, 70s, 80s. I think we are clawing our way back from that period. And the less space that the cars own, the more space that the people own, hopefully. And so that's, I think, the key to the future is not having the machines control everything, which is the irony of the conversation.
But it's also interesting how how mobility, in a way, influences how cities are developed so much. Like, for example, car is the invention of the 20th century, and it influenced the suburbia, right, quite a bit. And it seems like a number of technologies coming together in the 21st century. So autonomy may or may not be one of them, but sharing, definitely. Or smartphones, internet, cloud computing, and so on. They're enabling, it seems like, a different kind of city that is denser and like what we've seen in Kent Larson's slides.
All right.
When I first got married about 30 years ago, my wife put on an outfit and she goes, "Does this dress make me look fat?" Well, me as a scientist, I said, "Deborah, it has nothing to do with the dress." And either you are or you are not.
You're still married.
We got to be careful that we don't blame technology. We are the users of it. It is there to serve us, so we have to decide, and it's for us to choose.
Well, that is a great note to actually end, because that goes back to, and this will frame the discussions of this afternoon. We're going to adjourn to lunch in just a moment. There's a couple of panels that will address this, but particularly this afternoon when we have the special keynotes by Ed Glazer and Adam Greenfield, and the column after that, we're going to get into the discussion of the politics, the economics, really beyond just the technology, but who is wielding them and how is they affecting cities and how we should use them. So please, a round of applause for our panelists. And now we are adjourned for an hour for lunch. Thank you so much.